Nobody expected Bob Dylan to stop the song halfway through, but that look he gave down to the front row lasted 8 seconds, and in those 8 seconds, everyone understood something had ended. Madison Square Garden. October 1978. The Slow Train Coming Tour, though nobody knew that name yet. The album wouldn't come out for another year. This was just another stop on another endless tour. The kind Bob Dylan had been doing for so long that the cities blurred together, the venues became interchangeable, the faces in the crowd multiplied into an anonymous sea. 12,000 people packed into the arena. The lights dimmed. The band started. Dylan walked on stage without fanfare, without introduction, the way he always did. No wave. No smile. Just the weight of the guitar strap settling onto his shoulder, and the first chord. 3 songs in, he started. Forever Young. It was a song everyone knew. A song that had become something he couldn't quite control anymore. It belonged to graduation ceremonies now, to commercials, to moments he'd never intended when he wrote it in 1973 for his own son. But he played it anyway, because some songs demand to be played even when they've been taken from you. The second verse. The harmonica. The familiar rise and fall. And then Dylan stopped playing. His hands went still on the guitar strings. The band, confused, played 2 more measures before they realized something was wrong and began to fade out, one instrument at a time. Drums last, always last, that final cymbal decay hanging in the air like a question nobody knew how to answer. The arena held its breath. Dylan didn't look at the band. Didn't look at the crowd as a whole. He looked down. Straight down. At someone in the front row. The look lasted 8 seconds. Most people in the arena couldn't see who he was looking at. But everyone felt it, that sudden shift from performance to something else entirely. Something private happening in public. Something breaking. Dylan's mouth moved. He said something, but he wasn't at the microphone. Nobody heard it except whoever he was speaking to. And then he turned and walked off stage. No explanation. No apology. Just gone. The house lights came up. The audience sat in confused silence for 30 seconds before the murmuring started. Technical problem? Was he sick? Would he come back? The tour manager appeared on stage, looking as confused as everyone else. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay. Please remain in your seats. Backstage, in the narrow corridor between stage and dressing rooms, Bob Dylan leaned against the concrete wall, his guitar still strapped to his body, his eyes closed. His road manager, Victor, found him there. "Bob? What happened? Are you okay?" Dylan didn't open his eyes. "There's someone in the front row." "Yeah, there's 12,000 someones." "No. Someone specific. 4th seat. Center section." Victor waited. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. "I need 5 minutes," Dylan finally said. "The crowd is." 5 minutes. Victor knew better than to push. 20 years of working with Dylan had taught him that when Bob needed to stop, you stopped. You didn't get explanations. You just trusted that whatever was happening mattered more than the show. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. To understand what happened in those 8 seconds, you need to understand what happened in 1963. Bob Dylan wasn't Bob Dylan yet. He was 22 years old, playing coffee houses and folk clubs in Greenwich Village, sleeping on friends' couches, borrowing guitars, writing songs that were starting to get noticed but hadn't changed the world yet. One night at the Gaslight Cafe, after a set that went well but not great, an older man approached him. Not old, maybe 50. But that seemed ancient to 22-year-old Bob. The man wore a worn suit jacket and carried a notebook. "You got something," the man said. Not a question. A statement. Bob nodded, not sure what to say. People told him that sometimes. Usually they wanted something. "But you're afraid of it," the man continued. "I can hear it in your voice. You're writing around what you really want to say." Bob stiffened. "You don't know what I want to say." "No. The man agreed. But you do. And you're not saying it yet. The man handed Bob his notebook. I'm a teacher. Was a teacher. Got blacklisted in '52. McCarthy years. Haven't worked since. He smiled, but it was tired. I used to teach literature. Poetry. I had students who had something, like you do. I told them what I'm telling you. If you've got something to say, say it. Don't wait. Don't soften it. Don't make it safe. Because one day you'll look back and wish you'd been braver. Bob took the notebook. What's this? Poems I wrote when I was your age. Before I got careful. Before I started worrying about keeping my job and fitting in. He turned to leave, then stopped. My name's Martin Kellerman. You won't remember it. Nobody does. But maybe you'll remember this. The world doesn't need another careful voice. It needs the truth, even when the truth is ugly. Bob never saw Martin Kellerman again. But he kept the notebook. And 3 months later he wrote, The times they are a-changin'. In one sitting, barely looking up from the page, writing with the kind of fearlessness that Martin had talked about. The song changed everything. Bob's career exploded. He became the voice of a generation, a label he would spend the next 40 years trying to escape. The notebook got packed away in a box somewhere, lost in the chaos of touring and fame and becoming someone he never intended to be. 15 years later, October 1978, Madison Square Garden. Bob Dylan stood on stage playing, Forever Young, and looked down into the front row and saw a face he recognized. The man was older. 70 maybe? Thinner. Frielier. But the eyes were the same. And he was holding a notebook, that same worn notebook Bob had returned to him backstage at some forgotten venue in 1964, saying, You should keep this. It's yours. Martin Kellerman. Somehow. Impossibly. Sitting in the front row of Madison Square Garden, holding that notebook, looking up at Bob Dylan with an expression that said, You did it. You said it. You were brave. And Bob Dylan, who had spent 15 years running from that voice of a generation label, who had gone electric and alienated half his fans just to prove he couldn't be boxed in, who had retreated into cryptic lyrics and hermit-like privacy, who had done everything possible to become unfamous while staying famous. Bob Dylan looked at Martin Kellerman and realized he'd spent 40 years carrying that one conversation. That's when the music stopped. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. Backstage, Dylan told Victor, Bring him back here. 4th seat, center section. Older man, gray hair, holding a notebook. Bob, we've got 12,000 people. Please. Victor had never heard Bob say please before. 10 minutes later, Martin Kellerman was led through the backstage corridors by a security guard who didn't know why he was bringing an old man with a notebook to Bob Dylan's dressing room, but had learned not to ask questions. Dylan was sitting on a folding chair, guitar across his lap, when Martin walked in. They looked at each other. 15 years compressed into a single glance. You kept it, Dylan said finally, nodding at the notebook. You gave it back to me. 1964, Philharmonic Hall. You said I should hold on to my own words. I remember. I didn't think you would. Dylan stood up, setting the guitar aside. Every word I've written since 1963, I've written because of what you told me that night. Every time I was afraid to say something, I heard your voice telling me to be braver. Martin's eyes filled with tears. I was a nobody. A washed-up teacher who lost his job. You were someone who told me the truth when I needed to hear it. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Martin opened the notebook, hands trembling slightly, and turned to a page near the back. I wrote this in 1950. I was 32 years old and thought I was going to change the world with poetry. He smiled sadly. I didn't. But you did. He handed the notebook to Dylan. The page contained a poem, rough, unpolished, but honest. Dylan read it slowly. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. Can I keep this? It's always been yours. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. 20 minutes later, Bob Dylan walked back on stage. The crowd, restless and confused, erupted when they saw him. He raised one hand, not a wave, just an acknowledgement, and waited for them to quiet down. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He just adjusted his guitar and said into the microphone, "This next song is for someone who taught me something a long time ago." He played Forever Young again. From the beginning. But this time, something was different. The way he sang it wasn't for the crowd. It was for one person. Fourth seat, center section. Martin Kellerman sat in the front row, clutching his notebook, tears streaming down his face as Bob Dylan sang a song about staying forever young, about staying brave, about never growing old in your soul even when your body fails you. When the song ended, Dylan didn't acknowledge the applause. He just looked down at Martin one more time, nodded once, the kind of nod that meant everything and required no words, and moved into the next song. The rest of the concert happened. The crowd eventually forgot about the strange 20-minute interruption. Reviews the next day mentioned a brief technical delay, but nothing more. But everyone in that arena, whether they knew it or not, had witnessed something. They'd seen the moment when Bob Dylan stopped being an icon and became a person again. When he chose connection over performance. When he honored a dead 15 years old. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. Martin Kellerman died 3 months later. Lung cancer. He'd known he was dying when he bought that concert ticket, spent nearly all his remaining money on a front row seat because he wanted to see, one last time, what had become of that scared 22-year-old kid he'd met in a village coffee house. Dylan didn't find out until weeks after the funeral. A nephew of Martin's tracked him down through the record label, sent him a letter explaining that his uncle had talked about that night at Madison Square Garden constantly in his final weeks. He said you stopped the show for him. He said it was the proudest moment of his life, not because you were famous, but because you remembered. The nephew included something else. Martin's will had specified that his notebook, the one Bob had returned in 1964, should go to Bob Dylan after his death. He wanted you to have it. He said you'd earned it. Bob kept the notebook in his guitar case after that. He didn't read it often. But knowing it was there mattered. A reminder that the scared voice telling him to be braver had belonged to someone real. Someone who lived and died and left almost no mark on the world except for one conversation in 1963 that changed everything. In 1989, when Dylan was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and had to give a speech, something he hated, something he'd spent his career avoiding, he mentioned Martin Kellerman. Not by name. Just, "There was a man once who told me to say what I meant. I didn't always do it. But I never forgot he said it." Most people in the audience had no idea who he was talking about. But somewhere, Martin's nephew was watching on television, and he understood. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The notebook sits in Bob Dylan's archive now, catalogued and preserved alongside lyrics and recordings and all the other artifacts of a career that spanned half a century. Researchers who've seen it note that Dylan has written in the margins, not changing Martin's words, just adding his own in pencil, a conversation across time between two writers who briefly touched each other's lives. On the page with the poem Martin gave him in 1978, Dylan wrote in small, careful handwriting, "You were brave. You just didn't know it." That 8-second look in Madison Square Garden, the moment Dylan stopped the music and looked down, lasted longer than any song. It's still lasting. Because that's what connection does. It doesn't fade when the sound stops. It doesn't end when the lights come up. It just is. Forever. Like staying young. Like staying brave. Like keeping your word to someone who believed in you before anyone else did. Bob Dylan played Forever Young thousands of times after that night. But he only stopped the song once. For a man nobody knew. For a debt nobody else could see. That's the thing about Dylan they could never quite capture in the documentaries, or the biographies, or the endless analysis. His debts weren't to the audience. They were to moments like this. To people like Martin. To the ones who saw him before he became the icon. The notebook stayed with him until the end. When asked once why he kept it, Dylan said only, "Because someone told me to be brave when I was afraid. And I was." Madison Square Garden, October 1978. 8 seconds. One look. One old man in the front row. One promise kept 15 years late but right on time. The music stopped. The world kept turning. But everyone who was there that night understood they'd witnessed something that mattered more than any song. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. In Martin Kellerman's obituary, there was one line. He taught literature until 1952 and lived quietly thereafter. No mention of Bob Dylan. No mention of that night. But in the margins of an old notebook, in pencil, in Bob Dylan's handwriting. You were brave. You just didn't know it. Some debts can't be paid with music. Only with silence. Only with stopping. Only with looking down and seeing someone who saw you first.